Okay, this is one we're doing on Liberia. It's liable to be long, go multi-parted. At the very end, whenever, and sometimes it just clicks off on me, but at the very end, regardless, up in the top left-hand corner, we'll go to the next part, and so on through it. If you ever get to the next part and want to start over again, it'll be in your top right-hand corner, except for the very last one, and it'll go on to a previous article that I have or some information. Now I'm doing this because somebody got on one of my older videos, and the conversation got to the point where he admitted that the West African primitives didn't have anything to do with the Bible or Egypt, but they had nice places like Mali and all of these. And I mentioned that Mali was founded by Queen Tenhanen, and I was a Berber and stuff, so they can't really claim that. Or Timbuktu, and gave him a video about that of one of the ones I did. So that made him real mad, but then he came off and said, well, they had a couple other places in Liberia, and that they had taken over Liberia, and that they had done great in it and some other stuff. And I'm like, wow, that's deluded as hell. And I decided just to go ahead and do this video rather than to even try to type to him, and maybe I'll just put it in the next comment below it, and let's see what he thinks about it. For all you have to do is look this up. But a warning to you, this is meant to be very PC friendly, and they're leaving out some things that are a little bit touchy subjects and so on, and making very light of some things and speaking of them in a different way. In fact, whenever we get down to a middle portion and the end, and you can see all of the changes that are done to this before it was allowed to be left alone, we'll show you some type of thing about it. Anyhow, Liberia is officially the Republic of Liberia, and it's a country on the West African coast, and is bordered by Sierra Leone to its northwest, Guinea to its north, Ivory Coast to its east, and the Atlantic Ocean to the southwest. So it's part of the slave coast that was there. And looking at this map that's here, it's right after the bend down at the very bottom left, and I can't get on top of it. This is it right here, right? And so it covers an area of 11,369 square kilometers, or 43,000 square miles. So it's huge, and has a population around 4.9 million. English is the official language, of course, because it was set up by England and stuff, but we'll get there. But over 20 indigenous languages are spoken there, representing the numerous ethnic groups who make up more than 95% of the population. Well, I mean, no matter what, the other 5% is an ethnic population, isn't it? Are you going to, they're going to correlate it? The 5% of the population is the people that make up the amount that came from American slavery and went back over there. Probably because they use a number like that later. It's possible. The country's capital and largest city is Monrovia, and that's supposed to be named after James Monroe, and so that shows you how long this has been going on. And it's somewhat of a modern city, and but I wouldn't even compare it to something like Detroit, probably. But it's just, still. Liberia as a settlement of the American Colonization Society, so ACS, and we'll mention that quite a bit through this. So the American Colonization Society, you might look up into that separately or whatever, who believed that black people would face better chances for freedom and prosperity in Africa than the United States. Now, that's the belief that, well, you see it still evident in America, where there's an extreme problem and there's a lot of crime and things, and it's hard for blacks to live up to the laws that we have and stuff, and they have this, rampant hatred for cops. Real recently, in the last 10 or 15 years, they've come out with all these weird things. They want to say they were the Egyptians and they were the actual people of the Bible, and wear these outfits and stand on street corners and yell at white people and say they aren't part of their own religion, but it's all about black people and stuff, and a real identity crisis for some of them and things like that. But people said a long time ago this would alleviate anything like that ever happening, and having to have some false identity or living a lie or and everything. And of course, all the racism that they keep using, and it's become their new favorite word. Anytime somebody disagree with them, it's racism. So, um, but of course, there wouldn't be racism if they were back in Africa and around other black people. But let's see how that went for these people and stuff. So um, that ACS believed that they would do better back there, and we're now in the year of return that they've called it. There's this thing where the first black people that ever made it to North America was in 1619. Though it was already going on in South America and had been going on in Islamic slave trade, been going on for over 900 years, well over 900 years before that. But we discount that. It's all white man bad this one moment. So 400 years. And they've even tried to compare that to some biblical story and try to think that they're recreating something out of the Bible and stuff. Of course, that's this year and already past the date and everything. And people have said all kinds of crazy things like black space Jesus is going to come down and set all white people on fire and enslave them and rape their women and do all kinds of crazy things. And yeah, I've got it recorded and stuff. Although a lot of them, after they say things like that, then they erase it and go on and say it someplace else and stuff like that. And it's disgusting to see something like that. And so this is supposed to alleviate that maybe from ever having to have happened. But even in that year of return, we're not seeing black people. As it geared up, they seem to have just dropped that totally and kind of looking around like la 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 la. Meanwhile, in the press and everything, oh, everything's so racist. Donald Trump, oh, end of the world, and all of these things, and really doesn't any of that have to happen. And those people saw the Wakanda movie and everything, and they're like, come on back because you've been around them long, and you got to come on, you got it going on and everything and stuff. So, but it doesn't seem to happen. I don't know what the numbers are at this point of them actually going back in their fated year of return, but if you're not quite ready till next year, you can go back next year and the year after that and so on. But, go ahead and you can get a great place in it and stuff, and maybe even get into their government and stuff like that, or in real high positions to start looking for people definitely that can do anything of value. So the U.S. did not recognize. The country declared its independence in July 26, 1847. The U.S. didn't recognize Liberia's independence till about February 5th, 1862, during the American Civil War. So it was part of that whenever they were doing all that and then releasing the slaves and everything, and then they recognized them and did all that. Between January 7th, 1822 and the American Civil War, more than 15,000 free and freeborn black people who faced legislated limits in the U.S., and 3,198 Afro-Caribbeans relocated to the settlement. And you're like, what? Yeah, well, 15,000 went back at first and everything. They wanted to go back, and of course that's their heritage, their thing and stuff, so they went back. But they're freeborn. What's that? Oh, there was a whole lot of black people that were under freeborn and released and everything and educated. You have to look back into it. You've probably been listening to that narrative you've been told for so long, and everybody's getting whipped and lynched all day long and raped. Yeah. No, that's not our culture. But let's continue. The U.S. did not recognize their independence, though, till afterwards. And they relocated, though. The settlers carried their culture and tradition with them. And be known, no, they didn't. The settlers carried a new mimicking or mocking of Caucasian culture that they had been around exposed to in the Caribbean and in the Americas. They didn't go back to wearing loincloths and things like that in any way, shape, or form, or voodoo, really. And they'll tell you a little bit later about that. The Liberian Constitution and flag were modeled after those of the U.S. On January 3rd, 1848, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, a wealthy freeborn African American from Virginia who settled in Liberia, was elected Liberia's first president after the people proclaimed independence. That's way back in 1848, but black people don't know about that part about it in any way, shape, or form. Here's what their flag looked like, so that's the reason they say they modeled it after the American flag and stuff. And here's the coat of arms, and did it go to it somehow? No. It's trying to pull it up, and it can't. Oh, it's trying to pull up the song. And the song is All Hail Liberia, Hail. But let's see if I can. Anyhow, if you can see it there, it's like a seascape, a palm tree, some farming equipment now, and a boat going back, and then a dove with a ladder. And again, this is where it basically is right here, looking at world scope. And so it's part of the slave trade. It'd come from down about right about in here all the way to right about here. Anything right in there is pretty much Sahara, and then we start Berber and all Caucasian parts of North Africa was that way, endemic from since forever, and of course Egypt and stuff too. Even the Horn back in the day, and all the areas down through there, and what we call Somalia and Ethiopia today was quite different. Even though it's called Ethiopia today, it's not the same as back then. In fact, it was called Abyssinia, but that's a total different thing. Let's zoom in on this just about right, and there it is. There's the Republic of Liberia, and you can see the boat and everything that goes along with that. Liberia was the first African republic to proclaim its independence, and is Africa's first and oldest modern republic. So everybody else was still colonized at this time or whatever, and getting Caucasian assistance and all the things that went along with all of that. It retained its independence during the scramble for Africa, and this is where pretty much everybody grabbed, and you can see all the different colors, different parts of it and stuff, and colonized it, and was pretty much, taken out of the pre-Stone Age level and bush people stuff that they were into a modern world real rapidly. During World War II, Liberia supported the United States war efforts against Germany, and in turn, the U.S. invested in considerable infrastructure in Liberia to help its war effort, which also aided the country in modernizing and improving its major air transportation facilities. In addition, President William Tubman encouraged economic changes internationally. Liberia was founding member of the League of Nations, United Nations, and Organization of African Unity. Now that was that's way much later than what we're trying to talk about right now. Funny how they run up with it, but that's like 1945. But also we built an airport there. They're not saying things in a way that's really correct into it. And we also gave them a bunch of guns, which caused a whole bunch of problems and things too. But that kind of gets said different right there. And later too, it's kind of mulled over, but they do make mention of it enough, and I will make mention of it enough to point it out to you. The Americo-Liberian settlers did not relate well to the indigenous peoples they encountered, especially those in communities of the more isolated bush. The colonial settlements were raided by the Kru and Grebo from their inland chiefdoms. American Liberians developed as a small elite that held on to political power, and indigenous tribesmen were excluded from birthright citizenship in their own land until 1904. After they took over, they pretty much enslaved the local people there and oppressed them, and then took over as the elite. Yeah, it's hard to believe, isn't it? But they say here, in an echo of the United States government treatment of the Native Americans. Well, given the opportunity to do it better, it seemed like the first thing that was opted was definitely the other. And so now that they've been educated a little bit and pulled up into a more society, they considered themselves elite, and going back, and they took advantage of the primitives themselves. Well, before it all started, that was them capturing and selling off their own people. I don't know if you believe the narrative where white people were running around trying to catch black people with nets, but it's not the way it worked in any way, shape, or form. But So, Americo-Liberians promoted religious organizations to set up missions and schools to educate the indigenous peoples. So they tried to get missions to come down there, and they had a whole lot of problems with that. A lot of the missions got killed. Bad things happened, which I probably can't mention and get this thing knocked. But so let's just say a lot of that didn't go good, just like very many missionaries into sub-Saharan Africa didn't fare too well quite often. But they wanted to set them up so they could learn about the Caucasian Bible and the Caucasian God and everything, and Jesus and stuff like that. In 1980, political tensions from the rule of William T. Tolbert resulted in a military coup during which Tolbert was killed, marking the beginning of years-long political instability. And somebody ate his heart and stuff, and it was a cannibal warlord situation. But 5 years of military rule by the People's Redemption Council and 5 years of civilian rule by the National Democratic Party of Liberia were followed by the First and Second Liberian Civil Wars. These resulted in the deaths of over 250,000 people, which was over 8% of the population, and the displacement of many more, and shrank Liberia's economy by 90% by their own hands. A peace agreement in 2003 finally led to the democratic elections in 2005, in which Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected president. National infrastructure and basic social services were severely affected by the conflicts, with 83% of the population now living below the international poverty line. And this Sirleaf ended up getting caught in a whole bunch of corruption. And although the Americans and a whole bunch of white country were sending them aid to the tune of millions, adding up to billions, it was really corruption, and they'll mention it a little later. And we could go through all these topics right here on it. I'm going to try to skip some of them. So here's a map of it, and we can look at this that we're talking about. And so this is it, and this is pretty much it right here, what's called the Grain Coast. Its shores changed a little bit and ran up over longer too because of the Virginia, and it's the Fulrow River, I think, is its in, so it got a little more land even than this. But here's your Gold Coast, Slave Coast, Benin. They call it the Grain Coast, but they also called it the Pepper Coast because the Spaniards and everybody that took over and everything brought all kinds of different foods for it, and they started growing them, and they did real well there, and kind of were trying to take a niche if they could. And so really, and up here is the desert, Sahara, which look at P of Zahara, yeah, that's the other linguistics giving a version of it, Negro land. And so this was pretty much the Negro lands, and over here was not, it was considered Ethiopians, which is really Khoisan land and everything, but they were calling that Ethiopia instead of the little place Ethiopia, and all the little states weren't that. And what we call Ethiopia today, and the admixed people there that are 40-50% Caucasian, are not what was there in ancient times that we talk about. And if you look at the Greek explanation of Ethiopia, they show you a map and all the places they called Ethiopians, and it's not, doesn't have anything to do with each other. But black people like to use that quite often whenever they talk about ancient times and who they may have been related to and so on like that. But none of these people over here, of course, knew that Egypt existed or part of the Bible or anything like that. Even though whenever these people did settle it, they started naming some of the rivers and places like that, Jewish names and stuff, or the Jewish slave masters, and they look back at that and they try to say, well, see, no, that's out of the Bible. And it's like, no, the Bible is from the Tigris and Euphrates and Mesopotamia and da-da-da, and the land of Canaan and so on. Little Egypt talking about it, not in too great a favorable hand, but Egypt was Caucasians, of course, too. The only black people around them were Nubians, and they weren't allowed through Egypt by decree, but that's something totally different. So that's really the area that we're talking about, okay? And so now we'll get on to, well, no, it's fixing to be all the way, yeah. So, So it's called the Pepper Coast by some, but also known as the Grain Coast. And it's because they had set up through there off that river valley that I showed you that run through it, a whole lot of farming to help out and everything and to make them self-substantial and everything else. This was all reset up and everything pretty much by the U.S. government for them, and a lot was put into it to try to make it somewhat successful, but they also had a limit to that. But it seems like that limit's been passed long ago, for there's been billions spent just on this one country. And I don't know how old you are, but you might remember the commercials of people there and showing pot-bellied kids and so on, like they did in Ethiopia, or what we call Ethiopia now, and so on like that, where they were really having problems. Um, so Mande speaking people expanded westward from the Sudan in the 12th century. So all the way from East Africa and the Sudan had come all the way over. And I've had black people use that and say, well, oh, look, here's a connection to ancient Egypt. And it's like, yeah, it was a one-way trip this way. There's no genetics from there over here. Oh, yeah, there is. There, and these people have admixed. That's admixed after the Islamic slave trade. We're talking about ancient Egypt, building it and everything. Are you still trying to get people to believe that West African primitives were actually the pyramid builders or something? Oh man, you've got to stop that. That's disgusting. Anyhow, so whenever they expanded over the Sudanese, they were forcing many smaller ethnic groups southward towards the Atlantic Ocean, pretty much. The Dia, Basu, Kru, Gola, and Kissi were some of the earliest documented peoples in the area, and so they pushed the locals out, who were already being oppressed by the people that had gone back from the Americas. Yeah, this is looking great. This influx of these groups was compounded by the decline of the Western Sudanic Mali Empire, and it folded in 1375, and the Songhai Empire, when it folded in 1591. The area now called Liberia was part of the Kingdom of Koya from 1450 to 1898. As inland regions underwent desertification, inhabitants moved to the wetter coast area, and so caused some problems, and caused problems with people that were trying to just even get it theirself and be prosperous theirself. And this caused extreme problems. Shortly after, the Maine conquered the region, and then the Vai people of the former Mali Empire immigrated into the Grand Cape Mount Country region. The ethnic Kru opposed to the influx of the Vai, forming an alliance with the Maine to stop further influx of Vai. So you can see how this is an enveloping of warring and tribal things and crisscrossing, and that's what Africa's really full of, and stuff, and borders and who is where changes quite frequently. People along the coast built canoes and traded with other West Africans from Cape Verde to the Gold Coast, but that's a more recent thing. Arab traders entered the region from north, and long-established slave trade took captives to North and East Africa, and they don't put dating on that, right, but that's all the way through the Islamic slave trade. It started 900 years before the Americas were even found, and ran hundreds of years past, and over 1,400 years. Some people try to minimize it to 1,275 or something along that line. Early colonization. Between 1461 and the late 17th century, Portuguese, Dutch, and British traders had contacts and trading posts in the region. So they were setting up trading posts and doing things. This wasn't just slave trading. They were setting up their own places, and the people weren't living on the coast. Black people don't swim, so much and everything. There's wide open areas. People were living in inland valley areas and stuff that contain a lot of vegetation and so on. They're still really hunter-gatherers at this point, right? So the Portuguese named the area Costa de Pimenta, and if you know what pimento cheese is, pimento is the little red thing in there, and that's a type of pepper, and so that's where it kind of gets the name Pepper Coast. But it later came to be known as the Grain Coast due to the abundance of Malagueta pepper grains, and European traders would barter commodities and goods with the local people. And whenever they didn't have enough goods, it turned to people, and then they started attacking each other and then capturing in them and selling off their own people as unwanted, and things like that happened. But in the United States, there was a movement to settle free-born blacks and freed slaves back in Africa. This was ostensibly because they faced racial discrimination in the form of political disenfranchisement and the denial of civil, religious, and social privileges, like Jim Crow laws and things that we eventually got rid of, and civil rights and everything. But black people were really never intended to stay. And we the people that the forefounders of America and the Constitution, everything wrote, was supposed to have been really white Christians, is what they said that it was built on. And it never, when they say all people are created equal, they weren't talking about slaves at that point or anything other than themselves, we the people. But nowadays it's looked at, we were supposed to be some big melting pot. They got that idea going on, when I was a kid, because we had a lot of ethnicities here. And then all of a sudden it became a big grab bag for everybody to try to get into America and stuff and live the American dream. And now it's gotten to the point where Americans can't even live the American dream. So that's the reason we've slowed down on immigration. Plus there's problems inherent whenever you actually take people of this caliber, say, and put them from a third world country or whatever into a modernized country. We can easily see just from stats and stuff the FBI's got and everything else, it shows you that it's has its issues and stuff, and it's really showing itself in Northern Europe, and started reaping its head in America very badly too. And so I think that's what helped slow it down, and common sense. And now we're trying to build a wall, but boy, don't you remember the Dems, and they were saying it's not a problem, and trying to thousands, hundreds of thousands across a week until they could get that thing built. And it's still not totally built, by the way. So it still goes on, and people are still being caught going across. But that's another issue totally in another video. So they wanted to settle them back in Africa. This was ostensibly because they were going to face racial discrimination. So most whites and the later small minority of black nationalists believed that blacks would be better off in Africa. And so in other words, most whites believe that blacks would probably do better off in Africa, because being forced to be around the people that can fly and will shortly become the spacemen is not going to do their inferiority complex or anything, any type of good. And later it'll cause problems. They might say things like they were the Egyptians or they were in the Bible and stuff, and cause all kinds of problems, and actually make their own racism by their own hand, Jesse Smollett, and try to do things like that. So people had foreshadow. In fact, I think they tell you in a minute that Abraham Lincoln had no intention of blacks actually doing that. Sure, he freed the slaves, but then they were supposed to go back. There were some that was supposed to have had 40 acres and a mule, but that was some other people's idea of what was going to happen. That never really happened. And wasn't that Democrats? And you know that in 1860 there was no Republican slave owners. Oh, and even before that, long before that too, and then only minority of them in any way. Jim Crow laws is under Democrats too, but it's funny they've got blacks to somehow manipulated into voting Democrat pretty much straight across the board, even though they don't know what's going on since God knows when. And we'll talk about their politics here. It'll probably be after in part 2, though, as it's coming up. But we're already at, close to 30 minutes here. And we'll go about 45-ish and then do a split, unless it clicks off earlier than that. If it does, it's in the top left-hand corner, and we'll go to part 2. So most whites, and later a small minority of black nationalists, Waskangs, believe that blacks would be better off in Africa too. Well, but all the other Negroids really wanted to stay, it seemed, and would rather be up under whites and stuff, which was kind of like not really probably part of the deal, but somehow it became part of the deal. I'll probably have to do an entire video on that and what it reveals, but and use code words during it. But anyhow, Southern slaveholders had a different perspective. They wanted to get free people of color out of the South. Whoops. Where they were thought to threaten the apparent stability of their slave societies. So there was a movement, but they're looking at it totally different there. There was a movement of a lot of previously freed black slave owners, as long as they weren't owning their own land and slaves too, which happened an incredible amount, they would generally move north and everything. And really a lot of the wealth was up north and a lot of farming was down south, and that's the problem. And that's what made them wanted to really put it together and make America one. For most people don't realize it, but shortly before this, Spain owned all the way down into Florida and everything, and next to it, France owned Louisiana Purchase area all the way up into Middle States or so on, and out west nobody knew anything. But then Spain owned out over there too, and then remember the Alamo and stuff that went with that. But that's neither here nor there. So now we're going to go on to part 2 and look in your top left hand corner and see you there.